Mara's hands were shaking before she even reached the table. Not because of the man sitting at it, not yet. She had carried plates past dangerous men before. Men who wore their silence like a second jacket, who tipped exactly 20% and never made eye contact with anyone below their own level of importance. She had learned to move around them the way you move around a fire, close enough to do your job, far enough to stay safe. But tonight felt different. Tonight had a smell to it. She had been a waitress at Carino's for 3 years, long enough to know every regular by their order, their mood, and how they held their fork. Long enough to know that table 9, the one in the back corner, the one angled so that whoever sat there could see every single door in the room, was never just a table. It was a position, a deliberate choice made by a man who understood that the difference between a long life and a short one was almost always about where you chose to sit. His name was Dominic Ferrara, 41 years old, black hair going silver at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than bone. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who have worn expensive things long enough that they stop noticing. He had a watch that Mara could not name but could feel the cost of from 6 feet away. She knew his name the way everyone on that side of the city knew it, not from a conversation, not from an introduction, but from the particular way people's voices dropped when they said it, from the way bartenders straightened up, from the way other men in expensive suits gave him exactly the right amount of space, not too close, not too far, like orbiting something with too much gravity to ignore but too much heat to approach. You did not ask about Dominic Ferrara. You just knew. And sitting across from him tonight, as she had for the past 4 months, was Natalie. Mara did not know Natalie's last name. She knew her face, oval, symmetrical, the kind of face that made people trust her immediately. She knew her voice, warm, unhurried, never too loud. She knew her order, grilled salmon, no butter, sparkling water with lemon, no ice. She knew that Natalie always arrived first, always had a book open on the table that she never seemed to actually be reading, and always smiled at Mara the way people smile when they need someone to believe they are comfortable. Tonight, Natalie was not comfortable. Mara noticed it in the first pass. The book was open, but Natalie's eyes were not on it. They were moving, small movements, carefully controlled, the kind of movements you make when you are trying very hard to look like you are not looking at anything in particular. Her right hand was in her lap. Her left hand was around the water glass. She was not drinking from it. She was holding it. Mara took their order. She smiled. She walked back to the kitchen. She stood at the pass for a moment, breathing. Over 3 years in this restaurant, she had developed a particular skill she had never been able to name or explain to anyone who hadn't spent time carrying plates for strangers. It was not intuition exactly. It was more like pattern recognition built from 10,000 small observations about how people behaved when they thought no one was paying attention, a muscle trained in silence. And every muscle in her body was telling her something was wrong at table 9. She went back twice before the food arrived, refilled the water, brought extra bread neither of them had asked for, gave herself reasons to be close. On the second pass, she saw the phone. Natalie had it in her lap, screen facing up. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the angle. She was holding it tilted, slightly forward, like she was trying to make it easier to see without moving her head. And her thumb moved twice in the time it took Mara to set down the bread basket and straighten up. Not a text, not a scroll. Something deliberate, quick, intentional. Mara walked back to the kitchen. Natalie excused herself from the table 12 minutes later. Bathroom. She was gone for 8 minutes. When she came back, the book was in a slightly different position. Dominic was on his second glass of water. He had not touched his phone once. This was the part that stuck with Mara later, when she tried to explain it to the one person she eventually told. Not what Natalie was doing, what Dominic wasn't doing. Most people, even powerful, controlled people, reached for their phone when they were alone at a table. It was reflex. It was the modern version of having somewhere to look. Dominic simply did not. He sat with his hands on the table and his eyes on the door, and his breathing at a pace that made Mara think of someone who had spent years learning how to be patient. He was not relaxed. He was trained. Natalie came back and the conversation resumed. Mara watched from the far side of the room. It looked like a normal dinner. It sounded like one. She could hear the low register of their voices without the words, the occasional softness that suggested shared history, the particular music of two people who had been in each other's company long enough to have their own rhythm. But Natalie's phone came out again at 43 minutes into the meal. She was faster this time. Whatever she typed in under 5 seconds. She slid the phone back into her lap and picked up her fork without missing a beat. Mara had stopped moving somewhere between the bread station and the nearest wall. She had seen that look before. Not on Natalie's face specifically, on her mother's face. On an ordinary Sunday morning, in the kitchen of the house where Mara grew up, 3 days before the phone call that changed everything about what Mara understood to be safe, or permanent, or true. Her mother had been sitting at the table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, a book she wasn't reading, and that same look, the look of someone managing 2 conversations at once, the one happening in the room, and the one happening somewhere else entirely. 3 days later, Mara's mother had confessed to her father something that dismantled their family in the space of a single afternoon. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, precisely, like pulling one thread that unraveled the entire thing. Mara had been 17. She had learned, in the months that followed, that the most dangerous thing a person could do was pretend not to see what was directly in front of them. She was not 17 anymore. She picked up the check presenter from the nearest station. She took a receipt from her apron pocket, the duplicate from their order, already printed. She turned it over. She clicked her pen. For a moment she stood very still. She was not a brave person by disposition. She would have been the first to say this. She was a person who worked long shifts and paid her rent 2 days late every month, and had a nursing school application sitting on her kitchen table that she opened and closed and never quite submitted. She was a person who had learned to stay in her lane, because her lane was the only thing she could control. But there were 9 words forming in her head, and they would not stop. She wrote them. The handwriting was small, tight, slightly crooked at the end where her hand had moved too fast. She folded the receipt once. She walked to table 9. She set down the check presenter with the receipt tucked beneath the edge of Dominic's espresso cup, the folded note just barely visible under the white ceramic. She said, "Can I get you anything else tonight?" Natalie smiled and said, "No, thank you." Dominic did not look at the note. He looked at Mara. Not threateningly, not warmly, just directly. The way a person looks at something they are deciding whether to classify as significant. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Natalie and asked her something about a trip they had apparently been discussing, and Mara walked away without allowing herself to look back. She went straight to the stockroom. She stood between 2 shelves of canned tomatoes and a case of unopened olive oil, and she pressed both palms flat against the cold metal shelf, and breathed until her heart rate decided to behave. She had written 9 words on a piece of paper and slipped them under a cup of espresso belonging to a man whose full name most people in this city were careful not to say too clearly. She had no idea what would happen next. She just knew she could not be a person who saw something and said nothing. She had tried that once before, at 17, sitting at a kitchen table pretending not to notice her mother's hands. She had been living with the weight of that pretending ever since. The 9 words on the back of that receipt were the lightest thing she had put down in years. She straightened up. She went back out to the floor. She refilled 3 water glasses and took a dessert order from table 4 and did not look at table 9 for the next 11 minutes. When she finally did, Dominic's espresso cup had been moved. The receipt was gone. His face gave her nothing. He was listening to something Natalie was saying, his expression unhurried, his posture unchanged. Nothing about him suggested that a single thing in his evening had shifted. But the receipt was gone. And Mara, who had spent 3 years learning to read what people did when they thought no one was watching, understood that this meant something. She did not know what. She did not need to know. She had done what she could do, in the only way she knew how. Quietly, without ceremony, without any expectation of what came after. She went to check on table 6. Outside, on the street she could not see from anywhere inside the restaurant, the evening continued in its ordinary way. Cars moved through the intersection. A couple walked past with a dog pulling ahead on its leash. A delivery man locked his bicycle to a signpost and disappeared through a side door 2 buildings down. 3 parked cars sat at intervals along the block. None of them had moved in over an hour. Inside each one, in the specific stillness of people paid to wait without showing that they are waiting, someone was listening. They were not listening to Mara. They were listening to a frequency coming from inside the restaurant, from a device no larger than a button, sewn into the lining of a charcoal jacket belonging to a man who had no idea it was there. Or so they believed. Natalie had been sitting at a desk in a beige government office for 4 hours when the agent across from her said the sentence that changed everything about what she thought her life was going to look like. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way doctors deliver diagnoses, with a practiced flatness that was somehow worse than anger because it made clear this was routine, that she was not the first person to sit in this chair, that she would not be the last. "You have a choice," he said. "You can be a name on a list, or you can help us remove the names that are already there." His name was Gary Colton, 49, former military, moved through doorways the way people move when they have spent years going through doorways they weren't sure were safe. He had a wedding ring and a coffee stain on his left sleeve and eyes the color of old concrete. He looked like a person who had been disappointed so many times that disappointment had simply become his resting expression. Natalie had been brought in on a Tuesday morning in November. She had been on her way to a yoga class. She was wearing a light blue jacket and carrying a green bag, and she had been thinking about whether she should get her hair trimmed before the weekend. 2 men in plain clothes had stepped out of an unmarked car and said her name, and showed her a credential and asked her to come with them, and there was something in the way they said it, quiet, certain, offering no room for negotiation, that had made arguing feel genuinely pointless. She had sat in the back of the car and watched the city move past the window and thought about the very first moment she had understood that Dominic Ferrara was not the kind of man who existed in the ordinary world. It had been 4 months into their relationship. She had not gone looking for the information. It had arrived the way certain truths arrive, through a gap in the ordinary, through a door left briefly open, through a silence that lasted 3 seconds too long when she asked a simple question. She had made a choice in that moment, too. She had stayed. She told herself later, many times in many different configurations of the same interior argument, that she had stayed because she was already past the point where leaving felt safe. That was partly true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to look at, and she had spent months not looking at it directly. Gary Colton slid a folder across the table. He did not open it. He let it sit there. "We're not asking you to do anything dramatic," he said. "We're asking you to be where you already are. Notice what you already notice. That's it." Natalie looked at the folder. She did not touch it. "What happens to me if I say no?" Gary looked at the folder too, then back at her. "The contents of that folder become part of an active filing. Your name is in it several times, not as a suspect, as a known associate. But known associate has a way of becoming something more complicated over time, especially when the people doing the associating eventually become subjects." It was not a threat. It was a description of gravity, of the way things fall when there is nothing holding them up. She asked for a glass of water. Someone brought it. She drank half of it in one go and set the glass down and looked at the plain ceiling of the plain room and understood that the decision had already been made for her, not by anyone in this room, but by every choice that had led her to this chair. "What do you need?" she said. What they needed was modest, at least in the beginning. Names, faces, places, the kind of casual information that builds a picture one stroke at a time. Who was at dinner? What was said about travel? Whether any new faces appeared in Dominic's circle? Nothing that required her to act. Nothing that required her to be anywhere she wouldn't already be. She was not wired. She was not given a script. She was simply asked to pay attention and report, through a channel they established, a phone number that went to a voicemail box, a drop point for anything she wrote down, a monthly check-in with Gary in rotating locations that would look, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. The device came later. 6 weeks into the arrangement, Gary Colton sat across from her in a coffee shop near the river and put something on the table that looked like a small patch of fabric with a thin backing. "It goes into a coat lining," he said. "Jacket, preferably. Something he wears regularly." Natalie looked at it for a long time. "This is different from what you said. It's an evolution of the same objective." She picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. She thought about the charcoal jacket hanging on the hook by Dominic's front door, the one he wore to dinner almost every week. The one she had hung up herself half a dozen times because it was always the first thing he took off when he came home. She thought about how easy it would be, how invisible. She thought about the first time Dominic had ever looked at her, really looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, but the way a person looks when they are genuinely trying to understand something. They had been standing outside a restaurant in November, and he had said something quiet about the cold, and she had laughed, and he had watched her laugh like it was something worth watching. She took the device home. She sewed it into the lining of the charcoal jacket on a Wednesday afternoon, while rain hit the windows, and a television in the other room played a cooking show she wasn't watching. Her hands were steady. She had not expected them to be. The operation, as Gary described it in the careful language of people who made their work sound smaller than it was designed around a single objective. They did not need a confession. They did not need documents. They needed one name, spoken aloud, in a context that established its significance, that connected Dominic to a specific arrangement that had been under investigation for 11 months. One name, in his voice, from a device close enough to record it clearly. The dinner on Thursday was chosen because it followed a meeting. Dominic almost always made a call or mentioned something in the hours after his Thursday meetings. Gary had seen the pattern across 3 weeks of data. The Thursday dinners were when Dominic was most likely to be talking, most likely to be slightly loosened by the rhythm of a comfortable evening with a person he trusted. The person he trusted. That phrase lived in Natalie's head like a splinter she couldn't get to. She did not stop. She told herself she was past the point of stopping. That momentum itself was a kind of permission. She messaged the drop number before dinner, a single word that confirmed she had confirmed the jacket was on him. She sat across from him and ordered the salmon and drank the sparkling water, and listened to him talk about a trip they might take in the spring, and felt the particular horror of how normal it all felt. When she excused herself to use the restroom, she typed a brief message into the secondary phone she kept in the front pocket of her bag. Not to Gary, but to a relay point that went to the team sitting in the cars outside. An update. Everything proceeding. She had no way of knowing, walking back to the table, that a woman with small handwriting and a history of not staying quiet had already put 9 words under an espresso cup. She sat back down. She smiled. She asked Dominic what he thought about Lisbon. Outside, in 3 parked cars, 6 people waited. They were not thinking about the waitress. They had no reason to. They were focused entirely on the audio feed coming through the device in the jacket lining. Clear, steady, ambient restaurant noise running beneath the voices of 2 people having dinner. They were waiting for a name. They did not know that the man they were waiting on had already read a folded receipt, had already completed a calculation that took 32 seconds, and was currently asking Natalie about Lisbon in the voice of a person who has decided something and is simply waiting for the correct moment to move. Gary Colton was parked in the second car. He had a coffee in the cup holder and a jacket over his knees, and the particular patience of someone who had done this long enough to know that surveillance was 90% waiting and 10% everything happening at once. His earpiece crackled with restaurant noise. He drank his coffee. He waited. Dominic Ferrara lifted the espresso cup with his right hand. He drank from it slowly. He set it back down on the saucer. Then, without any change in his expression or his posture, he looked at the folded receipt sitting where the cup had been. He did not pick it up immediately. He let Natalie finish the sentence she was in the middle of, something about a restaurant recommendation from a colleague, somewhere near the water, supposed to have excellent food. He nodded. He asked a follow-up question. He waited for her answer and gave it the appropriate weight. Then he moved his hand to the saucer, lifted the receipt between 2 fingers as though checking the total, and unfolded it once against the table edge in a gesture so casual it could have been nothing at all. He read it. 9 words. He refolded it. He placed it in his breast pocket. He poured Natalie a glass of water because her glass was low. Inside, where nothing showed, the calculation had already started. He had not survived in his world this long by being slow or sentimental. Sentimentality was a liability he had watched end other men's stories early. What he had instead was clarity, a trained, practiced ability to take in information and move immediately to its implications, stripping away everything that was not useful and working only with what was. The note said, "She has been on her phone. Someone is watching you." He parsed this in pieces. The first piece, the waitress noticed something. This meant the thing Natalie was doing had been visible enough for a stranger to see it. Not good. Professionally executed operations did not generate notes from waitstaff. The second piece. Someone is watching. Plural implied by the general. Not one person. A team. And if a team, then a pre-planned position, which meant this was not new. This had been in motion for some time. The third piece, and the one that took the full weight of the 32 seconds. Natalie. He had known Natalie for 16 months. He knew her rhythms the way you know the rhythms of anyone you have spent significant time with, not by trying, but by the accumulation of ordinary moments that build a picture without announcing themselves. He knew how she moved through a room. He knew how she looked when she was genuinely relaxed and how she looked when she was performing relaxation. He knew the difference. He had noticed something tonight before the espresso even arrived. A small thing, the angle of her phone in her lap, the speed of her thumb, the way she had come back from the restroom with her eyes running just slightly ahead of her footsteps, checking the room. He had noticed it and filed it without acting on it because he was disciplined enough to hold information without reacting to it until he had enough to understand what he was holding. The note was the missing piece. He asked Natalie about Lisbon. He listened to her answer. He covered her hand with his on the tablecloth. He thought about the charcoal jacket hanging by the door of his apartment, the one he had put on tonight without thinking because it was familiar, because it was the jacket he always wore to Thursday dinners. He thought about the last 6 weeks. He thought about Natalie's hands. He had been in this business long enough to know what competence looked like and what an amateur looked like, and the truth that formed inside him over those 32 seconds was not angry. It was almost clinical. She had not been the one to approach him. Someone had approached her. He understood the mechanics of that. He had seen it before on the other side. It was not personal in the way people meant when they said personal. It was structural. She was a lever someone else had found and decided to use. This did not make it clean, but it made it comprehensible. He excused himself. "Restroom," he said. He stood and buttoned one button on his jacket from habit, then unbuttoned it, because he was going to leave the jacket on the chair. He set it on the back of the seat carefully, naturally, like a man who was warm. He walked toward the back of the restaurant. He did not walk to the restroom. He moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who has a right to be everywhere he chooses to be. Nobody stopped him. The line cook at the far station glanced up and looked back down. A dishwasher stepped to one side without being asked. The back door was a fire exit with a push bar, and Dominic pushed it and stepped into the alley behind the building and did not look back. The car was there. It was always there. His driver, a man named Owen, had been with him for 9 years and had developed the quality of someone who understood that questions were most valuable when they were never asked. Owen pulled out without a word. In the restaurant, the charcoal jacket hung on the back of Table 9's chair. The device in its lining continued to transmit restaurant ambient noise, the low sound of other people's conversations, the clink of glassware, a soft instrumental track playing from the speakers near the bar. No voices from Table 9. In the second car on the block, Gary Colton's earpiece delivered silence. Not the silence of two people not talking, the silence of an empty space. He sat forward. He listened harder. He reached for the radio. "Status on primary?" A voice from the first car. No movement visible. Gary looked through the windshield at the front entrance of the restaurant. The door had not opened. Nobody had come out. He counted to 20. "Check the kitchen exit." The man in the third car, parked at the far end of the block, angled to cover the alley, came back immediately. "Vehicle departing rear alley. Unable to confirm occupant." Gary was out of his car before the sentence finished. He moved fast, contained, in the manner of someone who had been trained to move without looking like they were moving. Through the front entrance, past the host stand, through the dining room, eyes cutting across tables without stopping on any of them. Table 9, corner, back left. The jacket, the empty chairs, a half-finished glass of water with lemon, 2 espresso cups. No Dominic. No receipt. Gary stood at the edge of the dining area and understood, with the specific coldness of professional failure, that they had lost him. He turned. Natalie was still at the table. She had not moved. She was sitting with both hands in her lap and her sparkling water in front of her, and the book open at the same page it had been open on when Gary had reviewed the pre-dinner surveillance footage. She was looking at the place where Dominic had been sitting. Her face, from across the room, showed nothing. But Mara, who had returned to the floor from the stockroom and was now refilling a water glass at a table 2 rows away, saw something different. She saw the way Natalie's left hand was gripping her own wrist under the table. She saw the 3 slow blinks. She saw the moment when Natalie understood, fully, what the empty chair meant. Mara set down the water pitcher. She gave them space. Gary pulled out his phone and made the call he had been hoping not to make, the one that began with a code word and ended with the phrase containment failure, and listened to the silence on the other end of the line that told him, more clearly than any words could, exactly how significant this was. 11 months of work, a device successfully placed, a team in position, one name away from everything they had been building toward, and a man who had walked through a kitchen and out a fire door and into an alley because a waitress had small handwriting and a habit of seeing things other people chose not to see. Natalie sat at the table for 9 more minutes. She knew, because Gary had been clear about this part of the protocol, that she should not move immediately. She should behave as though she was simply waiting for a man who had gone to the restroom and was taking longer than expected. She should check her phone once. She should drink some water. She did all of these things. When she finally stood up, she caught the eye of their waitress, the one who had brought the bread, who had been in and out of their line of sight all evening, who had set down the check presenter near the end of the meal. Mara looked at her for just a moment, not with accusation, not with anything that could be named or pointed to. Just a look. The kind that passes between 2 people who both understand something has happened, even if one of them knows far more about it than the other. Natalie put a $20 bill on the table for the tip. She picked up her book. She walked out. Mara watched her go. She did not know what had just unfolded around her. She did not know about Gary Colton, or the cars on the block, or the device in the jacket lining, or 11 months of operation. She knew only what she had seen and what she had done about it. She cleared table 9 with steady hands. She stacked the espresso cups. She wiped down the surface. She folded the cloth napkin that had been in Dominic's lap and set it on the tray. The charcoal jacket was still on the back of the chair. She hung it on the lost and found hook near the host stand. She did not think about it again that night. She finished her shift. She walked home in the cold. She made tea she didn't finish, and sat on her kitchen floor for a while with her back against the cabinet, because the floor was cold, and the cold was grounding. She thought about the receipt. She thought about 9 words. She thought about whether she had done the right thing or simply a thing, and whether, at a certain point, those 2 ideas were the same. She went to bed at midnight. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. The envelope was sitting under her apartment door when she woke up at 7:10. No name on the front, not even hers, just a plain white rectangle with no markings, wedged into the gap between the bottom of the door and the floor, so she almost stepped on it on her way to the kitchen. She stood in her socked feet and looked at it for a few seconds. Then she picked it up. She held it for a moment without opening it. Then she sat down on the entry bench, the one she used for putting on shoes, and opened it carefully. Because something about the weight of it and the plainness of it told her that whatever was inside had been put there deliberately, not carelessly, not by accident. Inside were 2 things. A money order. She looked at the number printed on it twice, then a 3rd time, because the first 2 times she thought she had miscounted the zeros. $14,000. Made out to the nursing school. Not to Mara. To the school. The specific name of the school, and even the specific department. The Office of Enrollment, 3rd floor, the office where she had once gone in person and spoken to a woman named Donna, who had told her there were still seats available in the spring cohort. She had never told anyone about that visit. She had told her friend Carrie she was going to the pharmacy. She had not even told her mother. The second thing in the envelope was a note. 3 lines, plain paper, handwriting that was clean and unhurried, not disguised, but not identifiable in any way she could point to. She read it once, then she read it again more slowly. For your education, not for the note. The note was just decent. Don't look for where this came from. Finish school. She set the note on her knee. She looked at the money order again. She understood very clearly what this was, where it came from, what kind of world it came from. What it meant that someone had known about her application and her visit to the enrollment office, and her full name, and her address, and what she wanted to do with her life. She understood that money from that world carried a history she could not see and did not fully want to know about. She also understood, in a quieter part of herself, something else. He had read the note. He had gotten out. And then, instead of forgetting she existed, he had found out who she was and decided, without asking for anything in return, without any mechanism for her to even say thank you, to give her something she actually needed. Not a reward. The note had been clear about that. Not for the note. For something else. Some accounting she did not have a name for. She was on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet before she fully registered the move. The floor was cold and the envelope was in her hand, and the money order was in the envelope, and $14,000 was a number she had not had in her bank account in her entire life, and she sat there and held all of it, without moving, for what she later estimated was around 20 minutes. It was not gratitude exactly. It was more like the feeling of a knot releasing that you had held for so long you had forgotten it was tight. She had put herself through the past 3 years on shift pay and tips, and the specific exhaustion of someone who is trying very hard to get somewhere by moving one small step at a time, without any particular reason to believe the steps were adding up. The nursing application had been sitting on her table for 4 months. She had opened it and filled in parts and closed it and walked away and come back and sat with it, and then put it under a library book she wasn't reading. There was always a reason to wait. The cost was too high. The timing wasn't right. What if she got in and had to stop working, and then couldn't pay rent? What if she was wrong about herself? That last one lived at the center of all the others. She looked at the money order addressed to the enrollment office and thought about Donna on the 3rd floor who had said there were still seats. She thought about the note, 3 lines, no signature. Don't look for where this came from. Finish school. Not a question, not a suggestion. A direction from someone who, for reasons she would never fully understand, had decided that her path forward mattered enough to clear one obstacle from it. Not all of them, just the one she had been unable to get past on her own. She did not try to trace it. She did not ask around. She understood that looking would be both useless and unwise, and she was smart enough to know the difference between gratitude and curiosity, and which one she owed herself the dignity of acting on. She got up from the floor. She made the tea she actually drank this time. She sat at the kitchen table, the one where the application had lived under a library book, and she pulled the application out. She filled in the parts she had been leaving blank. Financial declaration, enrollment date, preferred cohort, the section that asked about her long-term professional goals, which she had been avoiding because answering it honestly made the whole thing feel real in a way that was terrifying. She wrote what was true. Pediatric nursing. She had known this since she was 19, and had sat with her younger cousin in a hospital room for 6 hours and watched the nurses move through that space with a particular competent calm that had looked, to her, like the closest thing to a real superpower that regular human beings got access to. She finished the application. She put it in an envelope. She addressed it by hand. She mailed it the next morning on her way to the pharmacy, which was actually the pharmacy this time. The school sent a confirmation of receipt 14 days later. An acceptance followed 3 weeks after that. She gave her notice at Carino's, with a full month of lead time, because she was not the kind of person who burned things on her way out. Her manager gave her a small goodbye dinner. Her colleagues pooled together for a gift card and a card everyone signed. The regular at table 4, who had never once made eye contact with her in 3 years, left a $40 tip on her last night with the word, "Congratulations," written in the center of the receipt. She started school in the spring. She was not the top of her class. She was the one who stayed the latest, who asked the most questions, who went back to reread things she thought she had understood, because she respected the gap between knowing a thing and knowing it well. Her professors noted this without quite having a word for it. One of them, a woman named Dr. Faye Albrecht, who had been teaching nursing for 22 years and had developed a reliable instinct for which students would last in the harder moments, wrote in an end-of-semester note, "She does not scare easily. That will matter more than she knows." Mara read it once and folded it and put it in the same drawer where she kept the plain white envelope. She did not open the drawer often, but she did not throw any of it away. Life continued in the way that life does, not in dramatic arcs but in the accumulation of ordinary days that quietly become years before you notice the distance. She studied. She completed her placement. She passed her boards on the first attempt. She was offered a position in the pediatric ward of a hospital on the north side of the city, and she accepted it and showed up on her first day with clean scrubs and the particular steady expression of someone who has been practicing calm for long enough that it has started to feel like a natural state. She was good at the job, not perfect. She would not have claimed perfection, but good in the ways that mattered. She was steady when things moved fast. She was honest with parents even when the honest thing was hard. She remembered details about her small patients that the chart did not record, who was afraid of a specific sound, who calmed down when someone counted aloud, which child needed silence and which needed distraction. She did not tell anyone about the note she had passed, or the envelope she had found, or the money order that had paid her enrollment deposit. It was not that she was ashamed or afraid. It was that she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has thought carefully about a thing, that the story belonged to a moment that was complete in itself. Telling it would require explaining more than she was willing to explain about a world she had only ever glimpsed from the periphery. She held it. For 3 years. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday in a parking garage on the north side of the city, she told one person. Her name was Lucy Pemberton, 31 years old, a journalist writing a long-form piece on the mechanics of federal surveillance, specifically on the gap between what such operations cost and what they produced. Lucy had spent 14 months reporting the piece. She had spoken to over 40 people. She had found Mara through a chain of sources she had promised never to identify, and she had called and introduced herself and asked if Mara would be willing to have a conversation. She had been clear from the start. Nothing would be printed without consent. Nothing would identify Mara by name unless Mara agreed. The conversation was simply a conversation. They had met twice before the parking garage. Coffee, a walk. Lucy was the kind of journalist who did not push, who understood that the information she needed would only come from people who chose freely to give it, and that trust was slower than urgency, and worth more. On the third meeting, in a parking garage on a Tuesday in February, with the city doing what February cities do, Mara told her, not everything, the parts that were hers to tell. She described the restaurant. She described what she had seen. She described the note, 9 words, handwriting embarrassingly small, folded once and slid under an espresso cup. She described walking to the stockroom and standing between the tomatoes and the olive oil and pressing her hands to the cold metal shelf. She did not describe the envelope. She kept that. Lucy listened in the way good journalists listen, without filling silences, without reacting to things in real time, just taking it in. When Mara finished, Lucy was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Why did you do it?" Mara looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage, level 2, row C, a strip light above them buzzing with the particular hum of things that had been going too long without maintenance. "I'd seen that look before," she said, "on someone I loved, and I didn't say anything that time." She paused. "I didn't want to be that person twice." Lucy wrote something in her notebook. She looked up. "Do you think it made a difference, what you did?" Mara thought about this the way she thought about most things, all the way to the end of it before speaking. "I have no idea," she said. "I don't know what happened after. I never tried to find out." She looked at her hands. "But the note existed. I wrote it. He read it. What he did with it was his. That part was never mine." Lucy nodded slowly. "Do you regret it?" Mara looked at her for a moment. "Ask me something harder," she said. Lucy smiled. She closed her notebook. They stood in the parking garage a little longer, in the buzzing fluorescent quiet, and then they went their separate ways. Lucy back to her reporting. Mara back to a shift that started at 3. The article was published 8 months later. Mara read it twice. Her name did not appear in it. The restaurant did not appear in it. A waitress in a Chicago restaurant was mentioned in a single sentence as a peripheral figure in an operation that had already been detailed in full through other sources. The sentence noted only that an unidentified employee had observed behavior that went unreported to law enforcement. Mara set the magazine down on her kitchen table. She made tea. She thought about the word unreported and smiled slightly. Not at the inaccuracy, but at the specific narrowness of what reporting could mean. She had reported to the only person she had access to at the time, through the only channel available to her, in the only language she trusted in that moment. 9 words on a receipt under an espresso cup. She thought about the enrollment office on the 3rd floor, and Donna and the spring cohort. She thought about Dr. Faye Albrecht's note, and the drawer where she kept things that mattered. She thought about a parking garage on a Tuesday in February, and a journalist who listened without filling silences. She thought about what it meant to see something and decide to say something, not heroically, not with any clear understanding of where it would land, but because the alternative was being a person who didn't, and she had tried that version of herself at 17 and found it heavier than it looked. She was not the same person who had stood in a stockroom between canned tomatoes and olive oil and pressed her hands to cold metal and tried to remember how to breathe. She was older. She was steadier. She was doing the work she had always known she was supposed to do. The drawer in her kitchen held a plain white envelope and a folded note with 3 lines on it, and a Dr. Albrecht's end-of-semester card, and a few other things she had not quite been able to let go of. She did not open the drawer often. But every now and then, on the days when the work was hard and the hours were long, and the particular weight of caring for small and fragile human beings pressed down in ways she had not anticipated, she would go to the kitchen for water, and her hand would rest on the drawer handle for a moment. Just a moment. And then she would go back to work.